Great example of that. So back, I think it was in 2015, he announced that half of his cabinet was going to be women because it was 2015 or some like muddle-headed virtue signaling excuse for not thinking. I think only 20% or 25% of the elected MPs were female. So the proper balance on average would have been 25% female, 75% male. What he should have done was figured out what qualities would make for a competent cabinet minister, because it's actually quite important to have competent cabinet ministers, and then selected from among his people for nothing other than competence. But he could virtue signal, and then he set up the most important board, let's say, of the entire country on a quasi-random basis. Jesus, how pathetic. He should have been pilloried by Canadians for that. But we're so clued out, and also in the situation that you described, is like, if I say, well, 50% of Trudeau's cabinet shouldn't have been women, it's like, oh, you're a misogynist. It's like, no, only 25% of the elected officials were women. Now, you might say, well, it would be better if 50% of them were elected. It's like, maybe it would be better, but it didn't happen. So you can't fix it at the top end. It was appalling. So it's a hard argument to make, because you need to know that there's more difference within groups than between them in order to be able to come up with a credible argument, And then, so, yeah, I think that the Trudeau government is far to the left of where people originally assumed it would be. I mean, I think that his decision to put 50% women in the cabinet was an abdication of responsibility of a magnitude that we haven't seen before in Canadian political history. Only 26% of the MPs elected were female. And that should have been approximately the proportion of cabinet members. But to say this is 2015 or whatever the hell the year was, and then to abdicate his responsibility for selecting the most competent people was an indication of exactly how, what would you say, how suited he is to be prime minister. And people just didn't make much of an issue of that because of their attempts to be tolerant. But I think that what he did was, I thought the fact that he ran to begin with was reprehensible because he ran entirely on the name brand recognition that he had derived from his father.
Yes.
And I think that that's the mark of someone who's narcissistic. Yeah. He shouldn't have done that. Or
it worked, though. A lot of immigrants voted for him. My dad voted for him.
He's very charismatic and attractive, and he knows how to behave in public. And he had a very, very famous name. But I believe that it was immoral of him to run because we're not dynasties. Democracies aren't dynasties. And he hadn't the CV, the record of success that you would need as an independent individual to justify himself as a qualified candidate for prime minister. So I thought that his candidacy right from the start was ethically flawed. But then to multiply that error with these shallow attempts at broadcasting tolerance, especially at the expense of competence and the capacity to truly evaluate, is just inexcusable. Look, it's unbelievably widespread. So I'll give you an example that's very similar. Our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, announced in 2015 that half the cabinet that he put together would be women, despite the fact that only approximately, I think it was 20 to 25% of the elected officials were female. And so what he basically admitted, as far as I'm concerned, was two things. Number one, he was incapable of judging people on their competence. Because when you put together something like the cabinet for a country, what you do is you find the most competent people, period. Because it's so bizarre that it even has to be said, because it actually turns out that the cabinet is important. And so to me, all he did was default on his central moral obligation to screen every single one of his members of parliament with exceeding care and to pick the most qualified people. And his rationale was that it was 2015. And to reduce competence to racial, ethnic, gender identity, something like that, is an absolutely appalling move philosophically as well, as far as I'm concerned, to assume that diversity is somehow represented by group membership. There's no evidence for that. There's absolutely no scientific evidence for that whatsoever. In fact, the scientific evidence suggests quite the contrary, which is that there's more variability within groups than there is between groups, which is actually an antidote to the central racist claim, right? Because the central racist claim is there's more difference between groups than there is difference within them. And so, you know, you've seen one black person, you've seen them all.
Freedom of speech in your country is even more under assault than freedom of speech in our country back home. We still have a First Amendment. You guys have hate speech laws. You have a criminal code of Canada advocating for penalties of up to 2 years in prison for inciting hatred against an identifiable group, which is insanity, since obviously there is no great legal definition of any of these terms. They are all far too broad. As a lawyer, Bill C-16 is an abomination. Bill C-16 which the sponsors of the bill themselves, some of them have said, that it really shouldn't be a problem because, after all, if you make a mistake and mislabel a transgender person, that's okay. But if you do it intentionally, then you can be prosecuted under Bill C-16. I mean, this is a violation of basic free speech principles. It's also a basic violation of science. And we have now come to the point, for the left, where science itself is an obstacle to their agenda. And that's why you see on campus Professor Peterson being ripped up and down by University of Toronto for failing to properly abide by the idiotic strictures of an anti-scientific program that denies biology in favor of subjective self-measurement. Okay, you see Professor Peterson receiving a letter from the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science and the Vice Provost for Faculty and Academic Life stating that his refusal to call men women is, quote, contrary to the rights of those persons to equal treatment without discrimination based on their gender identity and gender expression, and they called Professor Peterson's decision to abide by biology unacceptable, emotionally disturbing, and painful for some students, and they threatened him with violating the Ontario Human Rights Code. Now, it is worthwhile mentioning that when it comes to the sort of speech codes that are used up here and are used on your campuses, they only seem to apply to certain groups in the hierarchy of victimhood. So Jews seem to be left out of this particular situation. Over at York, anti-Semitic propaganda has become all the rage, with boycott, divestment, and sanctions endorsed by multiple professors. BDS is, of course, a pure form of anti-Semitism, unwatered down and undiluted, despite all attempts to mask it. The York Federation of Students has formed an official alliance with the Students Against Israeli Apartheid. And there is, of course, the mural at the Student Center that showed a Palestinian man holding rocks and gazing at a Jewish settlement. According to B'nai B'rith, high school students who visited York were told they didn't understand victimhood because they were Jewish. All of this stuff is okay. But if you say that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, and you can't magically change from one to the other, you can't just pop a man into the woman machine and they come out like a star-bellied Sneetch from Dr. Seuss. If you say that, then all of a sudden you're violating hate speech rules in this country and on your campuses. None of this is rare in America either, obviously. America's college campuses are experiencing exactly the same thing. There is, fortunately, in the United States, still a legal framework under which you are allowed to say essentially what you want. We'll see how long that lasts, but that seems to be a pretty strong bipartisan tradition in the United States. But on campus, that tradition has gone the way of the dodo bird. The idea that you get to say what you want and think what you want, that no longer applies on America's college campuses. And that's because America's college campuses have one abiding goal, and so does the left more broadly. The college campuses are sort of just the tip of the spear. That abiding goal is equality of outcome, not equality of rights, not equal access to opportunity, equality of outcome. That's all that matters. All that matters is that we all end up in the same place. If somebody on the left sees somebody with $5 and sees somebody with $1 in the same room, they immediately assume the person with $5 had best give a couple of bucks to the guy with $1 because he clearly somehow stole from him. Right? Equality of outcome is all that matters. Now, America's founding fathers believed in equality of rights. They believed that we are all born equal in our rights, that God has provided us with certain inalienable rights that we can't give away, and that no one else has a right to impede upon. But that's not how the left thinks. The left thinks in terms of this equality of outcome. And the problem is the real world doesn't provide equality of outcome because, number one, we all start with different capacities. Right? Some of us are smart, some of us are stupid, some of us are tall, some of us are short, some of us have logic, some of us are protesters at college campuses. We're not all going to end up in the same place. We choose different career paths, we make different decisions about our lives, we work non-equally hard. And so what the left has decided is that if they can't achieve economic equality, they tried that for a century and it resulted in 100 million people dead. So they said, okay, we'll put that to the side for the moment. We'll come back later with like stupid Bernie Sanders like Justin Trudeau. And Bernie Sanders himself and we'll talk income inequality, and then we'll talk about social democracy, and then eventually we'll sort of start inching our way back toward the confiscation of wealth at point of gun. But while we do that, in the short term, at least we should have equality of feelings, and that we can do immediately. We can ensure equality of feelings right now. If we can't all feel equal in our achievements, then we can at least all feel equal when it comes to our feeling of victimhood at the hands of Western civilization. And the best way to do this is set up the hierarchy of intersectionality. And a bunch of people have talked about this tonight, but people say that it's hard to distinguish what that hierarchy is. It's not hard at all. We all know it, right? I mean, if you're on a college campus, if you're living in a leftist area, you know what the hierarchy of intersectionality is. You know, the folks whose opinions mean more. At the very top are the LGBT folks, and then below that are, this is the United States version anyway, right below that are black folks, and then Hispanic folks and Native American folks, and then women, and then Asian folks, and then Jews, and then straight white guys. Right? That's basically the hierarchy of intersectionality. And the thing is that your opinion doesn't matter. All that matters is where you are on this hierarchy of